Hi, Lily.
Right.
Sorry.
Oh, give me 1 second.
I want to leave that in.
All right.
Hi, Lily.
Hi, Anna.
Why did Shakespeare become a playwright?
I don't know, Anna. Why did Shakespeare become a playwright?
He couldn't find any other job because all the world's a stage.
Ha ha ha!
Hi, I'm Anna.
I'm Lily.
And this is LiliAnna's Preread Mediathek.
The podcast where we analyse and discuss audience preconceptions of media from a queer feminist lens.
Yeah. And if you're confused, we always start and end with a dad joke. And if you have any, please send them to us.
Yes. Cool. So today we're going to be exploring 4 different adaptations of William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. This play was first written around about 1598.
We think.
Was first published in the first... We think, yeah. Documents are clear. First published in the what was known as the First Folio in 1623. So it is around about 400 years old. But the adaptations we're talking about today will have come out in the last 30 years or so. So these are the 1993 film adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing, directed by Kenneth Branagh, the 2005 BBC TV one-off episode, directed by Brian Percival and written by David Nichols, the 2019 live recording of the stage production directed by Kenny Leon, and the 2023 film Anyone But You, directed by Will Gluck.
So we're going to be comparing them. We're going to talk about why the directors are adapting them, how they chose to adapt different elements of it, and the adaptation's relation to the cultures they were made in, because obviously 90s, 2005, also different mediums, like we have cinema, film, TV episode, we have live recorded play, different times, different mediums.
Yes. Because we're covering so much ground today, this is going to be a 2-part episode, so welcome to part 1.
Yay!
And we'll be giving our recommendations for media that we think you should check out at the end of part 2. So make sure you listen to both episodes and listen to them all the way to the end, so you don't want to miss those. Cool. So, Anna, do you mind explaining the very simple plot that is Much Ado About Nothing? What happens in Much Ado About Nothing, Anna?
Okay, so we're in ancient Messina, where we lay our scene. We have soldiers returning from war, with Don Pedro having welcomed Don John the Bastard, which the play continuously reminds us he is, back into his good graces. Among the soldiers are Claudio and Benedict. Claudio immediately falls for Leonardo's daughter, Hero, while Benedict and Beatrice go back to bickering. We don't know what happened between them before this, but we can freely speculate.
Yes.
And after a lot of trickery at a masked ball, very Shakespeare, Hero and Claudio plan to wed, but Don John, let's not forget, what is he, Lily?
The bastard.
Plans to fool people by making everyone believe that Hero cheated on Claudio before the wedding. Meanwhile, Leonardo and Don Pedro get everyone involved to trick Beatrice and Benedict to fall for each other by lying that one has confessed love for the other. And Borachio, one of Don John's men, is seen fooling around with Hero's chambermaid Margaret and duping Don Pedro and Claudio into believing the lie. This then leads Claudio to embarrass Hero at the wedding, ruining her reputation in the process. Like, he calls her out publicly. It's really a big drama. And Benedict professes his love to Beatrice, and she asks him in turn to kill Claudio for destroying Hero's life.
Reasonable.
Yeah. Hero, meanwhile, is faking her death, again very Shakespearean, at the behest of the Reverend.
Where have we seen that before?
To make Claudio regret his actions. The Watch overhear Borachio confessing to the plot and the lie is revealed, prompting Claudio into regret finally, because he didn't feel that before, because he sucks. Like, someone had to die for him to regret this whole thing. And Leonardo then tells him that he has a niece, a Hero lookalike, and that Claudio will have to marry her now. And at the wedding, the not dead hero appears, and both Claudio and Hero and Benedict and Beatrice end up in married bliss. So,
happy ending through.
Yes.
Yeah, well,
it's a lot. It's a lot.
So yeah, really simple. Yeah, simple plot. But yeah, thank you for that. One of the main sort of things that we use as a starting point of analysis on this podcast is Rowan Ellis's concept of a pre-read text. And a pre-read text is when you haven't engaged with the source material of a story or piece of media, but you have a strong sense of what it is about through interacting with various adaptations of that original material. These adaptations create a cultural consciousness of story or characters, images, concepts, etc., which might have very little or even nothing to do with the original source material, and instead all come from the adaptations that have come afterwards. So, a classic example of this is in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, in the film adaptation, the monster movie, Universal film adaptation of that. He's got green skin and bolts in his neck, and that wasn't in the original story at all, but has become the idea, the image of the monster that we know today. And we'll also be talking about adaptation theory in general. We'll largely be quoting from Julie Sanders's Adaptation and Appropriation.
Much Ado About Nothing is often cited as the original enemies to lovers story. I remember David Tennant, when he did the play, he talked about how so much stuff in Much Ado About Nothing we now use in other rom-coms. So we will be focusing our analysis on Shakespearean adaptations and rom-coms here.
Yes. And some overall questions that we'll be asking is how to adapt Shakespeare comedies into modern romantic comedies. What makes a successful adaptation for a specific era? What key elements make it Much Ado About Nothing and not just an enemies to lovers story?
Yeah.
And which I think is an interesting one, especially when you're adapting to a different time period or you're updating certain elements. How do you keep it still truthful to the original whilst also kind of changing it in interesting ways? And what change kind of goes too far, potentially.
Yeah.
And then something else that we're just going to keep in mind throughout this episode is how successful it is as an adaptation, versus what kind of politics is it reproducing. Because I think some of these ones that we're going to look at might be great at how it adapts something and how it updates it and how it's like kind of keeps true to the original, but like maybe isn't so great in what it's saying through adapting it in that way.
Yeah. Do we need to still, I don't know, for example, slut shame someone
Yeah.
in the 21st century?
So those are our main focuses. So let's meet the adaptations. So, kind of first up, we have the 1993 Kenneth Branagh film, Much Ado About Nothing, which is the one that I think of as like, as Shakespeare intended in the original, but it's obviously this film from 1993, but it's a very classic adaptation, or quite a famous adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing. And Branagh decided to adapt Much Ado because he thought its language was quite accessible for audiences, which I think is quite an interesting point to make. And I think I kind of agree with that,
Yeah,
to an extent anyway. It feels like something that you can follow even if you're not super into Shakespeare and you haven't studied this play a billion times.
It feels fun to watch.
I mean, it feels like a rom-com.
Yes, exactly.
So Branagh decided to set and film this adaptation in Italy, using mostly British and American actors, and uses quote-unquote colourblind casting, which, like, there's a debate around whether that kind of really exists.
Yeah.
So he casts Denzel Washington as Don Pedro and Keanu Reeves as Don John.
The bastard.
The bastard, of course. And sort of the way that Branagh sets it feels like it's out of time or in a timeless non-time. Parts of it feel old but with modern elements, and quite a few people have talked about this, the mixture of modern and archaic clothing and fabrics. So most of the women are wearing these flowy, archaic seeming white dresses, and the men, the soldiers coming back from war, have these flowy shirts, but then like they're wearing leather trousers. So you kind of have this mixture of different sort of times and fabrics and clothing that gives it this feel. And Branagh allegedly wanted the costumes to, quote, be as universal as possible, and to make this time period and setting feel deliberately vague, which is interesting.
The costume feels like the attempt was just period drama.
Yeah.
It feels like a period film, but you wouldn't necessarily know which period.
Yeah.
Just old, yeah, like you said.
Yeah, it's old, but then suddenly, occasionally, you'll be like, oh, that coat looks really modern. Like, what?
Yeah.
What? We're in the... Where are we? But yeah, it's quite an effective and interesting, like a very deliberately vague rather than just being a bad representation of a particular period. And yeah, and this production uses the original dialogue and the original scripts, which Branagh cuts and adapts. And then, so moving forward in time, chronologically, we have the 2005 Shakespeare Retold adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing. So this is part of Shakespeare Retold, a series of 4 modernisations of Shakespeare plays for TV made by the BBC. And yeah, this particular episode was written by David Nichols, which I just think is quite funny because, yeah, he's obviously one of those big names in British rom-coms. But this was actually released before One Day, which was his big breakthrough. The book was released, was in 2009. But obviously now, very recently, the Netflix series came out. So when I went to rewatch this, I watched this for the first time in about 2017 when I was at sixth form and I was studying this for A-level. And it didn't click at all that this was David Nichols and that meant anything. And then watching it this time, I was like, oh my god, it's David Nichols. Of course this is a rom-com. Of course. It's written by David Nichols. So yeah, I just found that quite apt. Yeah, I feel like now there's more maybe pre-read associations attached to the kind of writing that David Nichols does than maybe there was back in 2005. But yeah, just thought that was interesting.
So you're an OG fan and not just someone who came to this later.
Oh yeah, I didn't just watch this because it was David Nichols. I watched it because I had to study it at A-level. But yeah, so in this version, the story is transposed to a local television studio in the early 2000s. It's like aggressively 2005.
Yeah.
Like you're like, you know exactly what era this is when you watch it. And yeah, so in this version, Beatrice and Benedict are sparring co-hosts. And there's dynamics from the original, which is like family dynamics and also dynamics of rank within an early modern class hierarchy. So you have members of the nobility, princes, etc. This is all replaced by this workplace dynamic. You also have modernised language, changes to some of the character names. So Don John becomes just Don, Leonardo becomes Leonard, and they also make some key changes to the plot. But overall, this adaptation is very recognisable as Much Ado.
Yeah.
Not just in name, in its plot elements as well.
So jumping forward, a different medium this time again is the 2019 stage production, which is part of the New York City Shakespeare in the Park program, which is an event where Shakespeare plays are performed for free at the Delacorte Theater in Central Park in New York. Mm-hmm. And director Kenny Leon chose an all-black cast with Danielle Brooks as Beatrice. You might know her from Orange is the New Black. This sets the play in Atlanta, Georgia, and transposed 1 year in the future to the 2020 election. And the war that Don Pedro and his soldiers are returning from becomes an election campaign for racial justice, in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and Trump's first term as president. And it is an actual play that they recorded, and they used the original dialogue, which cuts and adapts, and they added some stuff to it, but we're going to get into that later.
Yeah, and it's like the only actual stage adaptation that we're looking at today, partly because it's slightly easier to access like recorded versions, and this one was recorded as part of PBS's Great Performances series and is available to watch online. And then we come to the 2023 film Anyone But You. So yeah, Anyone But You is definitely a loose adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing. It's set in the contemporary Australia, with early sections set in the US. Hero and Claudio are a lesbian couple called Hallie and Claudia. They are getting married in Australia. So in this context of this wedding, the power dynamics and relationships are all made into modern familial and platonic relationships. So there's no prince character. Everyone is either related or friends, rather than being brothers in arms and part of this band of soldiers. They're just friends. They're long-time friends, and that's how everyone knows each other, because there's no war or outside conflict in this version.
Yeah.
You have some black and POC characters. So, for example, Alexandra Shipp plays Claudia, and Jonathan is played by Darren Barnett, amongst others. And you also have some queer characters, but they only really exist as background characters and secondary love interests to the main white cis-het couple. We'll talk a bit more about this.
We had a lot to say about this one.
Yeah. And in this version, it pivots away from the original plot of Hero being set up and accused of cheating and loss of virginity. And it also pivots away from Beatrice and Benedict being tricked into love. Instead, all the conflict is about Bea and Ben. This version's Beatrice and Benedict, who instantly see through the trick of them being tricked into love. And then they begin fake dating. Because why use one trope when you could use a completely different one? So those are our adaptations, and now we're going to talk a bit more about the cultural and financial context for their adaptation. So, to start with some adaptation theory, Robert Wyman argues that adaptations respond to, quote, social struggle and political power and to acts of historical consciousness, end quote. So that's basically just saying that you have to look at adaptations in their socio-political and arguably personal context. Like their ideas and the reasons they're created and the things that shape them don't just come out of nowhere. You need to look at these sort of wider forces that are at play as well.
Yeah, think about like how much money it takes to produce anything, but how much money it takes to produce a play that's publicly funded versus a movie versus a TV episode.
Yes.
And all of that plays into how something is adapted. So let's start with Kenneth Branagh's film adaptation. What was the context for him to do this play specifically as a movie? Shakespeare is one of those things that just continuously is readapted all the time. And one of the most famous examples, it shocked me the first time someone told me this, and I was like, why did I not notice this? Was West Side Story in the 60s. Of course, this is an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. And then there's a 1968 movie I watched for school for English class, actually. Yeah,
did you? Oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh. What did you think?
We were bored to tears at the time. Yeah, we did not like it. But I will say my class also had no appreciation for West Side Story, and watching West Side Story with a bunch of teenage boys who call every time when they start dancing gay, I just was like, shut up, this is one of my favorite movies. That was not fun. But the 1968 movie actually was really popular at the time with teens, allegedly, because the cast was a lot closer to the age of the actual characters in the play, which they hadn't really done before. For I understand, it's quite serious. Yeah. However, there hadn't been a broadly popular Shakespeare film for a while before Branagh decided to do this. So Branagh's film in 1993 is just before the boom of the 90s and aughts adaptations. So there were a lot of adaptations after this movie, but not before.
Yes.
And notably, you could argue, though, The Lion King is a loose adaptation of Hamlet, but that was released in 1994. Also not as closely. I mean, it is Hamlet, but also it's, I mean, it is an original work still. Like,
yeah, definitely. And somebody had to tell me that you wouldn't necessarily guess that it's an adaptation of Hamlet.
Yeah. Even less so than West Side Story. West Side Story is closer to Romeo and Juliet than Lion King is to Hamlet. And then going forward, the adaptations were specifically aimed at teenage audiences and were made to be fun to watch. Like Baz Luhrmann's Romeo plus Juliet. Don't want to misquote what the movie is called. And then you had rom-coms like 10 Things I Hate About You that I love, which is an adaptation of Taming of the Shrew. And you've got She's the Man, which is an adaptation of Twelfth Night. And dramas like the film O, which is another Julia Stiles Shakespearean experience based on Othello.
So Branagh was working before there was this renaissance in Shakespeare adaptations, particularly for broad audiences or audiences that you wouldn't usually expect to watch Shakespeare. So arguably, I guess he had to convince studios that people would like watch this film, like a broad audience would watch this film.
Yeah, but before this, Branagh had already made a film adaptation of Shakespeare, so he made Henry V in 1989, but it's very different adapting Much Ado About Nothing and Henry V because it's got different challenges and there's also different goals. So we read Ellen Edgerton's piece. It's called Your Ancestor is Cinematical, which I just love as a title. And talking about Kenneth Branagh's Much Ado About Nothing, it says that Branagh's task was to sell Shakespeare to the contemporary masses. Quote, if Branagh had to convince his Henry V audience that the movies were worthy, then with Much Ado, he must convince them that Shakespeare is. So what that means is that if I watched Henry V and I didn't get it, I would assume it's on me because this is a really respected, famous play. But if I watch Much Ado About Nothing and I don't get it, I feel like you didn't make this entertaining enough. So, Edgerton speaks of, quote, an audience to whom Shakespeare is reading, unquote. So it's something tedious, intellectual, and not necessarily entertaining for the broad masses. And Shakespeare, Branagh also...
Freudian slip.
So Branagh didn't have the success of other adaptations like Romeo plus Juliet to work from in order to get funding for this movie as well. Yeah. And like we talked about before, the language is relatively accessible in this play and the plot is not too hard to follow, even though I just made it seem a little bit complicated.
Yeah. But like compared to something like what's it called?
Summer Night's Dream.
Yeah, Midsummer Night's Dream. It's like that like, what is happening? Whereas with this, at least, it does feel like a modern rom-com in some respects, because there's conflict and there's two couples and there's no supernatural elements, And it is easier to follow than, or certainly easier to follow than like a history play like Henry V. A rom-com's got a lot more broad mass appeal, especially in the 90s.
Yeah. So initially the film did get rejected by a few production companies because there were concerns of the script being too wordy for audiences. But it was eventually picked up by a Samuel Goldwyn company, and it made $43 million at the box office. But it was the highest, allegedly, according to Edgerton, it was the highest grossing Shakespeare film at the time. Arguably, we would argue anyway, helped pave the way for the success of the later Shakespeare adaptations, specifically for like mass appeal, that these were niche films. Yeah.
And so this leads on to the 2005 Shakespeare Retold, Much Ado About Nothing, which I would argue follows the successes of the Hollywood teen updatings of Shakespeare plays, although this one isn't really directed at a teen audience. Arguably, it's more of a maybe like 30s audience. And yeah, some of the other key differences here are that it is A, British BBC adaptation, B, specifically made for release on TV, and C, it has the accompanying low budget you might expect for a BBC TV adaptation. You can kind of see it in the set and the costumes and the cinematography. This isn't the most high-end production.
It does have Olivia Colman in it, though.
It does. Pre big fame Olivia Colman. It's so, yeah, she's just got this tiny part. She's so funny. She's so cute in this. The quality in this comes more from the level of the script and the acting rather than the budget. Everything in it, even at the fancy dress party, it feels like all of the more fancy costumes. That definitely came out of some costume cupboard from some historical drama that they did like a few years ago or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it actually does make sense to do, if you're on a low budget, financially it makes sense to do a Shakespeare. It's a really great thing to adapt because it's out of copyright. So it's easy to obtain the rights and you don't have to pay any money for them. However, for the BBC, there weren't just financial reasons for choosing to adapt Shakespeare, but also ideological reasons as well. So for this episode, we read Ramona Ray's article, Shakespeare and the Singletons, or Beatrice Meets Bridget Jones, Post-Feminism, Popular Culture, and Shakespeare Retold. In this article, Ray states that, quote, Shakespeare Retold was launched by the BBC in late 2005 as part of a concerted drive to reanimate the relevancies of Shakespeare for a range of early 21st century listeners and audiences, end quote. Which I think just sums up quite nicely the purpose of this adaptation.
Yeah.
Ray particularly argues that the series uses these Shakespeare adaptations to craft an idea of English identity in the context of globalisation. Anna, can you give us like a quick definition of globalisation for people who don't know? This is because when I first read this article, I didn't really know what... I have come across globalisation, so...
I feel like this is where you can tell the age difference between us, because this was just constantly discussed. I mean, it is still, but that term isn't in the newspaper anymore every single day. And so globalization is this a breakdown of barriers in terms of shipping wares across the globe. And because of tech advancement like the internet, there's a breakdown of limits as to how close production and markets have to be. In this context, the article was talking about how Shakespeare adaptations serve as a calm for the audience as well. That there's always good old England to fall back on that doesn't really change that much, even in the face of globalization, like you just said. It tells you specific about what is authentically English compared to the rest of the world, and it is Shakespeare.
Yeah, which is like actually, this is quite interesting in the context of Shakespeare, because it's been historically used as this tool of colonialism around the globe. So, for example, it's been used, like productions have been sponsored around the world in colonized countries to suppress other cultures there and present this English dominance. So it's interesting that this adaptation is falling into a bit of a line with that in some ways. And I'll link some more information about this if you want to find out more, because there's some interesting stuff about that. But yeah.
Because all those places that were colonized also have their own stories and their own plays that they could put on. But no. You will do Shakespeare.
Yeah. And as Ray argues, the episodes, quote, underscore stereotypical national associations and an English heartland unchanging in the face of the trappings of globalization, using Anglican churches, windy seaside promenades, and historic country hotels. Quote, so you have this quaint English aesthetic. We also have a majority white cast, especially in the leading roles. And I think it's also interesting that it focuses on a local news channel rather than a national or international news channel. And it's a specifically Southern English feel and identity that you get from this, because it's Wessex tonight. And that's quite funny. But yeah, it's got that very like microcosmic, I don't know, this very small specific, this is what England is, and it's this particular area of England as well. But yeah, so Ray writes that as a result, Much Ado Retold becomes this form of heritage export, using its Englishness to sell itself to a global postmodern audience. So in this version, you can see how kind of money and English identity are tied up together. The Englishness of Shakespeare is enhanced through the adaptation's creative choices, creating a sense of distinct and discrete English identity, and also something that you can sell to global audiences.
Yeah, it's like local, but it's also national, and it's also international. Because Ray then further argues that the BBC adapting Shakespeare works as a reciprocal process, so adapting Shakespeare affirms Shakespeare's legacy while lending validity to the adaptation. It affirms Shakespeare's continued importance in the contemporary zeitgeist. It's never modern, and it's also never irrelevant, because it was never off its time. It just becomes of our time because it keeps being readapted.
Yes.
Yeah. And what she writes is, quote, "The bard is authenticated via perceived proximity to source. Or to put it another way, even if Shakespeare is only dimly present, which we can see in anyone but you." That she doesn't say that, I say that. Continued the quote. "He nevertheless functions as the imprimatur for the revisionary play that unfolds across his oeuvre," end quote. So in the 2005 episode, Beatrice and Benedict quote Shakespeare, Sonnet 116, I believe, when they see Hero and Claude dancing, and they use it to mock them getting engaged. But then when they are later together in the hotel room, which is so sweet, they read Shakespeare again together, but this time it's sincere.
Yeah, it's so lovely. It's such a lovely scene.
Yeah. So Shakespeare makes the, quote, cynical older generation get together, but it's also mocked by them. So you kind of have it both ways. Ray is arguing that using Shakespeare quotes and also specifically mocking it is exactly what legitimizes Shakespeare for another generation. Because you both have, like, isn't this old and silly? And then also there's wisdom and value in this old work.
Yeah, so they have their Shakespeare cake and they eat it as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, now skipping ahead 14 years to 2019, we have, Kenny Leon's production of Much Ado About Nothing at the Public Theatre, not at the Public, at the Delacorte Theatre, an outdoor theatre in Central Park in New York City, as we said. As mentioned, so this production was part of the Shakespeare in the Park Festival in New York City, and specifically the New York City Festival was first conceived in 1954 and has run in one form or another ever since, and has spread as a concept to areas all over the globe. So there are like lots of Shakespeare in the Parks in lots of different countries. The original was in New York City. Yeah. Tickets to the festival are free of charge. And the ethos of the festival is about making Shakespeare accessible to the public by bringing it into public space. It's literally the kind of theatre company that sort of like holds Shakespeare in the Park is actually called the Public. And what the Public says about Shakespeare in the Park is that, quote, "It has long operated on the principles that theatre is an essential cultural force and that art and culture belong to everyone," end quote. However, their funding for the Shakespeare in the Park Festival is reliant on private donors, which is interesting. And as we mentioned before, this particular production was filmed and distributed as part of the Great Performances series on PBS, which is actually publicly funded in the US, with one private donor.
PBS as a channel is like the BBC, or in German UFI, the ZDF. These are publicly funded channels specifically.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, so we can see from this that Shakespeare is seen as something culturally valuable, enough so that companies and private donors would provide significant funding for productions, and that there's this sense that the public should have access to Shakespeare as a public good, and more so arguably than other types of theatre. I mean, just like other playwrights don't have decades-old festivals dedicated to them and have that festival reproduced in multiple parts of the world. That's just mainly just a Shakespeare thing. Yeah. But it's interesting to ask, why is this the case? Why is Shakespeare seen as this sort of really culturally valuable and important thing?
Universally acknowledged, sorry.
Yes, no, definitely. And literally a phrase that gets attributed to Shakespeare plays a lot is that they're universal in their themes and topics. So, for example...
Which is wild. Just given what they're about, it's wild.
Literally. It's like, Hamlet is a universal play about loss and mortality. But there's a Witch Please episode, and Witch Please is a podcast that's now called Material Girls, and one of the presenters of that podcast was talking about Hamlet and how it's seen as this universal play, but like I'm pretty sure that's about a prince of Denmark. Like a lot of these plays, obviously they're written in a particular time. They're also British plays, or they're often set in different countries, and they're also often about like the aristocracy. And in Much Ado About Nothing, it's like the nobility. We have a prince, and we do have some lower class characters, but they tend to be the comedic characters, the villainous characters. So And this has been said before by other people, but it's always old, dead, white authors and playwrights, usually men but not always, who get to be a universal voice for humanity. And everyone else who's a writer is niche and doesn't have a broad appeal. They're writing about like specific experience rather than universal experience. And in this way, it's quite significant. In this production, Kenny Leon chooses an all-black cast. In an interview on the Build series, you can find that interview on YouTube, Leon says that...
We'll put that in there.
This will also all be linked in our caption.
Yeah.
But Leon says that by having an all-black cast, it is, quote, an opportunity to uplift the universal messages Shakespeare laid down 500 years ago. And those messages are that we need to live in a world that is embracing of love, of laughter, of singing songs out loud, end quote. And that's Leon's interpretation of what this play is about and why it's important.
Yeah.
And this play really is about joy. There's so much singing, and these characters are having banquets and having masquerade balls and having a lovely time. But historically, adaptations have centred on white characters and their joy. Whereas in this production, Leon makes this play about black joy. So we have the dancing scenes on the lawn with choreography by Camille A. Brown. And you have a soundtrack of these old black classics, and it all feels really jubilant and joyful. It's a really lovely production to watch.
Yeah, we highly recommend checking this out.
Yeah. But at the same time, I think what's significant is that Much Ado is a play where there is a threat to the joy of the characters. And in this production, rather than that being an illegitimate brother, Liam makes that threat to Don John being the illegitimate brother. And while he's still there, in this production, it feels more like Leon is making that threat the white supremacy and fascism within America, and particularly under Trump's first term as president. That is the threat to the characters in this production.
Yeah.
So Leon's production is bookended with the image of the soldiers, quote unquote, as political campaigners, marching, chanting, holding placards. And at the end of the play, after all this kind of joy and jubilation, we've had this wedding, the characters got together, but they are called once again to this war. And this kind of draws attention to how fragile this peacetime is, and how fragile not only their joy is, but also their ability to address problems within their own communities and look at their community. So Grantham Coleman, in the same interview as the Kenny Leon interview, Coleman plays Benedict, and he highlights that, quote,
it's not so much that this is an all-black cast, but we're telling a story that takes place in a black community. And the story that we're telling has a threat outside, and we're black people coming together, trying to love each other, trying to make this work. And then still, within our own culture and society, we have knuckleheads who try and mess up the fun that everyone else is going to have. But the reality is also that, like, that's how we are. That's how we are with our families. We have family members who are like, man, Uncle Jesse's here. I don't have an Uncle Jesse. Don't worry.
I love the fact that there's so much more love here just because he doesn't call him the bastard, but like knuckleheads. There's just so much more love there. You know what I mean? He's not reducing him to his status within this family, but just like, he's being a prick. Yeah.
Yeah, literally. And the original play is like, Don John is the bastard and there is no place for him in society and he has to be cast out. Whereas it feels like it's, okay, how do we address this? How do we move on from this conflict and from this drama? And yeah, I think it's interesting that even though this uses the original dialogue, it kind of switches where the central conflict, like what that is about, which is cool. So I think this play offers a chance for this community to turn their lens inwards, to explore the joy, the messiness, and the truth, as Liam puts it. He talks quite a lot about kind of finding the truth in this play and what feels like the truth of the characters. But within the context of white supremacy, these characters are always a moment away from being called back to the broader fight beyond their fragile peace. So Leon explores this black community under white supremacy and a Trump government, which kind of expands and explores whose story gets to be universal. And it's really great. If you want to watch it, it's free to watch on Internet Archive. We will leave links below.
Yeah, I love this one. And it was also, again, in difference to the 2005 one, this sort of going back to the quote-unquote original script. It is wild how accessible it still is.
Yeah. And then finally we come to the most recent adaptation we're talking about today, and that's the 2023 film Anyone But You. As mentioned, Shakespeare rom-coms were huge in the 90s and 2000s, and this was partly because rom-coms were just a huge genre at this time. But more recently, there's been a dip in popularity of rom-coms as a genre, and there haven't been as many of them made. So one of the main aims of Anyone But You was to bring back the rom-com, specifically so that it can be like a money-making genre again. And this film definitely succeeded financially. Like, it made $220 million at the box office, which was like a lot more than the 1993 version. Obviously, not
a lot more.
Not taking into account inflation, obviously, but it's like $177 million more, which, you know, it made a lot of money. And its success has been heralded by many as the return of romcom, which I think we're going to talk about a bit more about in our next segment right now.
Yeah, so we wanted to talk about Much Ado in the Modern Rom-Com. Again, we're talking about enemies to lovers here. So when we talk about a movie rom-com as opposed to, again, a play or a TV episode, what is that and what is that formula? I'm going to be mostly focusing on romantic comedy. I'm going to pull here from romantic comedy, Boy Meets Girl Meets Genre by Tamar Jeffers McDonald and Broe Deschanel's video essay, The Anatomy of the Rom-Com. So when we think rom-com, we think a certain formula. For example, again, this is a very pre-read text, actually. Possibly you've never thought about what makes a rom-com, but according to MacDonald, the formula is thus: gain, loss, and then recovery. And MacDonald quotes David Shumway in the text saying, quote, "The love story is so familiar in our culture that we rarely give it a second thought. Beau gets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back is exhibit A of standard plots in all fictional media."
That's interesting, because I was like, oh, surely MacDonald or Shumway means boy meets girl, but it's no, in the context of a rom-com, it is boy gets girl. Yeah, interesting.
Especially, thank you for mentioning that, because it does remind me that the book that I'm quoting from here, the MacDonald text, is from 2007, and the Broe Deschanel video is quite recent. And
yes,
that is a very different understanding of what a rom-com is, because this book has not been written with the understanding of the 2010s. Not that we understood or learned anything in the 2010s, but and also really interesting, I thought, in the MacDonald's text, because I didn't think about this too much, but if you think rom-com, you think, oh, romance plus comedy, right? But also MacDonald talks about the mixed emotions these films commonly both depict and elicit. Crying frequently occupies an important space in the narratives of the romantic comedy, as an index of the pain a lover feels when apart from the beloved, when rejected or lonely. Is noted, crying about love, romance, and other romantic films is central.
Interesting.
And I do think that's wild. Romance plus comedy, and then there needs to be a moment where people are moved to tears.
Yeah, no, but it makes so much sense as well, because there has to be conflict and emotional stakes for it to be interesting. Like, you have to care. Like, the characters have to care enough about what's happening to them for you to care about what's happening to them. That's really interesting.
In this context, in the book, it talks about this is like drawn from the old movie, quote unquote, the old movie, meaning like these. Why is this what a rom-com is? So the screwball comedy in the 1930s, sort of up until around 1942, we say that's the screwball comedy era. You didn't have sex on screen, shockingly, but you had great dialogue between the leads to replace the sex in terms of narrative and tension. And it was satirical, and Deschanel talks about the quirked up heroine. So think Bringing Up Baby or It Happened One Night, which you and I together watched Bringing Up Baby, actually.
Did we?
That was really fun. No, sorry, It Happened One Night. That's the one we watched. We've both seen Bringing Up Baby.
Happened One Night was really good.
We've both seen Bring Up Baby, right?
Yeah, I've seen Bringing Up Baby.
I was like, one of those we watched together. Yeah. What followed post World War II was the 1950s and 60s, the quote-unquote sex comedies. And MacDonald has a really great definition. The sex comedy pits woman against man in an elemental battle of wits, in which the goal of both is sex. Again, this sounds much more sexual than it is when you watch 1950s movies, but yeah. The year 1953 was really interesting in terms of the sex comedy, because that was the year that Albert Kinsey published Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. So this is massive, right? So he published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male before, but now the Human Female, so now the mainstream is aware of the fact that women are having sex, women are having sexual thoughts. Also, very specifically, MacDonald talks about women having premarital sex. And yeah, also the year that the first issue of Playboy was published. And also there was a movie that came out called The Moon is Blue that I've not seen. But it was at the time considered super, super racy, and it didn't fulfill the restrictions it was supposed to fulfill. And despite those, it was a massive success because people still went to see it. And so, the industry was realizing that those restrictions we put on those movies don't work in terms of the business. Like, we're losing out on money, but also people still go to see these movies, even if we're like, no, this is improper. Please don't watch this.
Yeah, sex sells. They were realizing in the 50s that sex sells.
Yeah, they didn't know that before, I guess. And McDonald also says, quote, as with the screwball comedy, much audience pleasure derives from seeing the couple openly fight and insult each other and secretly yearn to fall into bed together. Aww. Yeah.
Yeah, that is...
Sorry, go.
No, that is very Beatrice and Benedict.
Yeah. And also one thing is interesting is that sex comedies love to feature one person pretending to be someone else in order to win over someone. So think Some Like It Hot, they literally dressed up as women in order to get jobs on that. What were they, like a traveling music group?
Yes, yeah.
Because masquerading to me feels so Shakespearean, but again, reading McDonald's text, I was like, oh yeah, this is so Much Ado About Nothing.
Yeah.
Yes.
And cross-dressing is very Shakespearean as well. Less so in Much Ado, but in general in Shakespeare, it's a lot of people, men dressing as women, women dressing as men.
In the 70s, you then, following this, you had, again, you have to think about the 70s being, now people have access to the pill. Obviously not everybody, but a lot of people do. And now that you have much more freedom, at least much more so than in the 60s, what do you do with the formula? You change it up, because if they can get together at the end, maybe you don't want that. Maybe that's more interesting. And so you still have the quick dialogue, but you're not really interested in the couple ending up together anymore necessarily. And there's much more independent cinema. And both McDonald and Deschanel mention Annie Hall here as an interesting example of this, because, sorry, spoiler, at the end they don't end up together. Also, I recently watched What's Up, Doc from 1972. And that movie specifically made fun of romance films, despite the fact that it is very rom-com-y. It is quick-witted. It is a lot of slapstick mostly. There's a lot of cars driving into buildings and stuff in that movie. It's a good time. But it isn't really interested in being very traditionally formula rom-com. Yeah. And then what comes is the movie that I think defines what a rom-com is for the 90s and the 2000s, which in 1989 is When Harry Met Sally, the Rob Reiner movie that, even if you've never seen it, again, you've seen versions of this film.
Yes.
Because everyone tried to copy it because it was very good. Yeah, and this movie defined rom-coms to be about two white, not poor, cishet people who have a meet cute. They don't hit it off initially, but slowly get together. Someone gets hurt, there's a grand gesture, and then there's a happy ending. Also, there's usually no criticism of heteronormativity, of capitalism, or of amatonormativity to be found in these movies.
Yeah, which I think is quite interesting. Actually, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I just think that, no criticism of heterosexuality or, like, heteronormativity. I feel like that's quite key. Like, that's quite key to Much Ado as a play. It kind of feels, like, possibly wasn't Shakespeare's intention, but you can read it as a criticism of heteronormativity in the way that the hero is treated. And it just struck me. I was like, interestingly, that kind of feels like it's like a key tenet of Much Ado, even though that's not a key tenet of the modern rom-com.
Yeah. Deschanel describes the era that followed as the irony poison 2010s, which I agree with, and I love that phrasing that she used here. There's nothing easier to make fun of than a sincere emotion, and you need sincere emotions for a rom-com. Yeah. For any romance, you need sincere emotion. If everything is ironic, nothing means anything. Yeah. One example of this is 500 Days of Summer, which, if you remember that trailer, I just remember that being played over and over again everywhere. It's like, this is not a love story.
This is a story of boy meets girl, but you should know up front, this is not a love story.
I was like, yeah, we get it. Yeah. Which we did an episode about, actually, which you can check out.
We did. Yeah, go listen to that. And it's also funny that, I mean, this is what happens, I guess. If something's popular, then there's a backlash. In the 60s, it was sex comedies, and then 70s, actually, we're not interested in them getting together. And then 90s, 2000s, rom-com was really popular. And then 2010 was like, actually, let's subvert everything, but in a way that doesn't really, I don't know, do justice to what it was originally. I don't know. Yeah, irony poisoned.
Because the 2010s was, we're self-aware for the first time, and it's like, no, you're not. This is not a new thing.
Yeah.
Every teenager realizes, like, oh my god, what does anything even mean? Everyone goes through that phase in life.
Yeah.
And McDonald specifically references Sleepless in Seattle here. That is a rom-com. Again, this came out the same year as Much Ado. And that movie already self-references old movies and rom-coms that exist. And what does genre of the rom-com mean in terms of gender and stuff? Movies have referenced themselves before this.
Yes.
This wasn't an invention of the 2010s. And McDonald also says, quote, basic problem with the Hollywood romantic comedy, it employs so formulaic a storyline. It is so overfamiliar a product that it is easy to take for granted. End quote. And I do agree with that because people think, oh, it's always the same, that it's easy to do well, and it just isn't. There were a lot of them in the 90s and 2000s, but that doesn't mean that they were not of quality. These are still very good films. There's like 15 Sandra Bullock movies that did this, but they did have very good scripts.
Yeah.
So now let's get to Anyone But You.
It's actually my movie.
Well, we'll see whose movie it is when it comes out.
Okay. Check out the new trailer for our new movie, Anyone But You, now. Better?
Just play the trailer.
Oh my god. Enjoy.
Jump ahead from the 2010s to 2023. So Deschanel argues that a rom-com needs good dialogue, a friend group that you want to be a part of as much as you fancy the leads, slapstick that's funny but not annoying. You need to want the leads to get together, you need to have a setting that makes sense. The movie has to have a take on the personalities of the leads, their jobs, their background. They should have aspirational apartments, jobs, or outfits. Think about like the Nancy Meyers rom-com and all the kitchens and all the articles about the kitchens. And you want a sad moment or a backstory to ground it if needed. Again, we talked about the crying aspect of it. And also Richard Curtis expanded this to having a crying aspect to the supporting characters in these movies as well.
Yes.
I would argue that that's not... Yes, the funeral and the four weddings and a funeral. Yeah. Yeah, I would argue that the rom-com doesn't necessarily need all these things, but enough of them need to work.
Yes.
So
I agree.
I only realized this because we were writing about rom-coms, but in When Harry Met Sally, the leads have jobs that we almost know nothing about. I know that she's a journalist and he's in political consulting.
Yeah, no, it's all about their free time. It's that kind of Friends thing where it's all about sort of what they do in the evenings and on their weekends.
Yes.
And they obviously have jobs that, I mean, I guess apart from Joey, who's like an actor, but yeah, anyway, it's like their jobs support them financially so they can enjoy their free time, but the job aspect isn't the part that's seen as interesting or important.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to have any impact on their lives financially or otherwise. These people are not struggling in any way, shape, or form. But I think that the reason that it works in When Harry Met Sally is because everything else is so entertaining and heartwarming and funny.
Yes.
That again, if I hadn't been reading about rom-coms, I would have never noticed that the jobs never make an impact really on the storyline in that movie. And I feel like almost nothing in Anyone But You. I'm going to be nice about Anyone But You at the end. But let's first talk about the stuff that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Listen, I've watched this movie 3 times. I deserve to bitch about it. I feel like almost nothing in Anyone But You is interesting enough to push through. Like, you don't have to have all these elements, but some of them should work.
Please.
So let's talk about the screwball comedy, right?
Yes.
You need quirky, funny screwball moments. You have the weird butt-touching scene, which I've never watched. I always skip over because I'm not watching that. It's just so weird.
It's
and
so weird.
Gross.
It's just not funny. You're just like, this should, like, haha, it's like butt touching. That should be funny. And it's just like what? I don't know. It just feels like a really just bizarre. It just feels bizarre, and like somehow they managed to make that not funny. And I feel like it's quite hard to make that kind of thing not funny. I don't know. It just feels really pointless. Like, you could just skip over it and it wouldn't make any difference to the rest of the film.
It also just doesn't make any sense. But what couple in front of you would just start, like, touching the inside of someone's, like, trousers or workout shorts in front of you? That wouldn't convince me that you're together. It would convince me that you have no respect for my right not to watch you do that in public. Like, it's just like... Yeah. There's a scene where they fall into the harbor, which is funny, but just used to send up the grand gesture at the end. There's constant nudity in it, but it feels like too in your face to make sense as a comedic moment. And it also feels really shamey, which, given that she's the person who is based on the character Margaret, who's the one that sets off the sex that then ruins the wedding, it feels so slut-shamey for no reason.
Yeah. No, literally, because you're introduced to her and she has her tits out in the first shot that you have of her, and it's just a bit, oh, this is what we're doing with this female character then. And it doesn't go too hard on making her the villain, but it sort of goes there, and it still kind of has this undercurrent of a slut-shamey, like, she's the sort of, like, lesser female character, she's a bit of a bimbo, and a little bit evil maybe, or at least antagonistic. It just feels a bit like gross watching it. You're like, oh, are we really still doing this?
It just feels so American, their point of view of Australians.
Yes.
Like, oh, Australians are really fit and really skinny and really tan and also are constantly nude for no reason.
Yeah.
And like easy.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah. And also, so I can't remember what I first noticed, but in a review about Anyone But You written by Nicholson, like, she basically says, like, it's all arse, no substance. I don't think that's exactly what she says, but essentially, yeah, and it's like, and I think that's really interesting as well, because especially compared to the screwball comedies, it's like you said, there's no sex, but there's great dialogue, and it kind of feels like it's replaced the great dialogue with just like lots of nudity. And I'm like, no, you can do both.
True,
You can have both things.
That's so true. Oh my god, do you remember that discourse? Actually, I don't know if you do, because again, we're different ages, but they always had so many nude scenes in movies, and then they were always talking about, why are you constantly forcing actresses to take their tops off for no reason? And then they were like, well, if you have to have a sex scene, it needs to make sense in the plot. And I don't know that I agree with that. I don't know that sex needs to mean anything. Whatever the director is, whatever story they want to tell, while respecting the actors and all that. But that's so true what you just said, because they just used nudity as a thing here to be like, look, and be like,
yeah,
I've seen tits before. What do you want from me? Yes, she's beautiful and all that, but I don't.
Yeah.
What does this have to do with this film?
And in Much Ado About Nothing, the dialogue is quite important as well, because it's like the whole point is that they're like sparring and they've got this great banter, and that's not the only element of the story, but it's like quite a key element. And if you just don't give them that good dialogue, that's not a very good adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing, in my opinion.
Maybe I should have started with this, but this movie wants you to know that this is based on Much Ado About Nothing, by the way. This is not West Side Story. They're specifically throwing quotes on walls and stuff, and they want me to know that this is Shakespeare. And I'm like, well, then why did you not use some things from the script for this? Because it would have made better dialogue. Yeah. Another thing that's meant to be really important is the setting. And why are they in Australia? Yeah. For the plot, not in terms of there's nothing wrong with Australia, but why? What does that have to do with anything? This movie literally could have been set in Austria near a lake. If you want that action movie shot, you just need some body of water. They could have set it anywhere. They could have set it in Austria. They could have set it in Switzerland. They could have set it, I don't know, a different part of the US. I don't know. But it's so confusing because it just has no impact on the story.
Yeah, it kind of feels a bit like a tick box. Okay, we need somewhere that's beautiful and they can be outside and they can be in bikinis. And it also needs to have like a landmark that maybe has some romantic associations, and there can be a grand gesture outside the landmark. Okay, cool, Sydney, that'll do. Like, it feels very, this is what a rom-com should have. This is what should be in the rom-com. Tick, rather than actually thinking what impact it has on the story. It's just, it feels like a tick box genre exercise.
Talking about the sets in this film, the house feels so soul and charmless. I couldn't tell you anything about it other than they had a lot of white furniture. But I don't remember anything specific about this house. I feel like even his apartment in this film has no personality, and it looks like nothing. Harry's apartment in When Harry Met Sally had like really, they used those scenes in the apartment for a purpose. They were moving around the rug. He was just recently divorced. There was a purpose to showing that he has to redecorate this apartment, that he's alone in the apartment. They used the large rooms to show his loneliness. Remember when he was flicking the cards into the basket and stuff? It all had a purpose. The setting and the sets had a purpose. And Deschanel talks about this at length, that the background was used to show the passage of time in terms of seasons. Yeah. But also not just in terms of seasons, like the time has passed, but also in terms of the plot. Like you show them buying Christmas trees together, which he then has to do alone when their friendship ends, when they quote unquote break up. Yeah. It all has a purpose in terms of the setting.
Yeah. And also, just jumping back to the house again.
Yeah.
I guess like the only part that works really, that makes sense, is the gulling scene.
Yes.
Where they're sort of making sure that Beatrice and Benedict overhear them being like, oh, they're in love with each other. And you have the garden with the big hedges and the windows, and you've got the spaces for people to talk behind different objects and things, which is very classic Much Ado About Nothing. And I'm like, in that sense, okay, sure, you've got that. You've got this one element from the original text that you've translated into this new place. It's not the most original way of doing it, but you've done it, and yeah, cool, you've done that. But yeah, in every other aspect, the house is just like, what is this supposed to be?
I'll give you the hedges. The hedges were cute. They also felt quite old-timey, and they did look a little bit like the ones in the play. But that just made me like the play more and reminded me of like the hiding behind the hedge, dancing along to the music. It just reminded me of the other adaptations that did it better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You talking about the 2019 version there?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good going.
God, that actor was so funny. Another thing you need is, again, Deschanel saying you want to be friends with a friend group almost as much as you want to kiss the love interest. Who are these people? Who are these supporting characters? Why is Ben friends with the brother? They're roommates. What do they do together? I don't understand. Like, after the night they spent together.
Oh, they roommates?
Yes. See, you didn't even pick up on that. Oh. They live together.
Oh, damn. Oh. Yeah, that was not clear in any aspect.
No, because when she stays over the next morning, his roommate says to him, the girl you blew me off for stayed over. And I don't understand why they didn't just add an activity to that. Like, you blew off basketball. You blew off cards. You blew off poker. Something.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have added more time to the script. It wouldn't have added more time to the movie. It wouldn't have made it longer. But you already know something about what they do when these people are... Like, you need to establish some sort of background stuff that isn't necessarily in the movie, but gives Ben a more personality and just more things so that he has a personality.
Yeah.
I just find this so shocking that this movie has lesbians in it and they are nothing. Like, they have no personality... But also with each other, they don't really have any, like, couples dynamic.
Like, they have the most surface level couples dynamic. It's like, Claudia likes to be organised.
Oh, yeah,
Hallie's worried about her sister. And maybe that'll stop them from getting married. Oh, no, it doesn't. It's just like, oh, they were a bit stressed because they're getting married. Okay, cool, they got married. They're given, like, the bare minimum and the most basic kind of characteristics.
Even when they meet at the bar, when they meet Ben for the first time, like one of them introduced, like one of them's friends with Ben and introduces the girlfriend. And she's like,
this is Hallie, my new girlfriend.
Are we saying that now?
Yeah, is that cool?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really like labels, but I like you a whole bunch.
What? Like, who does that in front of a dude for the first time? Like,
yeah.
Also, who talks like that in real life?
No.
Like, I've never, like,
No
are we
one.
saying that now? Like, what? Again, you could have used that for some version of the plot where, like, one of them drags the other one aside and is like, oh my god, you just call me a girlfriend for the first time, and then they kiss. That would have been already more exciting.
Oh my god.
I don't know, I just hate those lines in those type of movies because I'm like, no one talks like this. And the only real person is the dad. The character that Dermot Mulroney plays, the dad, is the only one that I remember having any sort of personality. And I was thinking about how we talked about the Marmee character in Little Women and how different adaptations do different things with her. And when these characters feel like real people that you would have met in real life, it makes the movie so much better. And the dad character to me is like, he's a little bit embarrassing, but he's trying to be self-aware, but he's also terrified of getting sun damage, so he's always like in a complete white cast.
Yeah,
and
no,
I was like,
he can't die.
this feels like a real dad.
Yeah, no, he feels like a
yes.
No, he's really cute. Yeah, he feels like a real dad character. Yeah. Yeah.
Or even like the proposal video, sorry, not the proposal video, the video invites to Australia. They play around with homophobia for a hot second, but not in an offensive way. But you can just tell that the dad was like, oh my god, this is going to be so funny. He feels like a person that you've met before.
Yeah.
Deschanel talks about the motivation. You need to care about these two ending up together. I don't care whether these two people end up together because I don't know why they would work as a couple.
Yes.
The script doesn't make me root for them or for the lesbians.
I know.
Which, do you know how shit you have to be for me to not root for lesbians? Like,
I know. Yeah, it feels like such a letdown.
Yeah.
It's such a letdown. Like, this film got nominated for a GLAAD award. It's like, I'm glad it didn't win because it does not deserve that.
Ba-dum-bum.
Anyway.
Yeah, and again, reading about the thing that MacDonald talks about, this appeal to tears, which, quote, an excess of feeling which is permitted release in weeping, which sounds really dramatic. Again, you don't need to make me cry, even in a rom-com necessarily. But that's why it doesn't make me weep, because it doesn't make me sad, because I don't care.
Bea cries in the taxi after she sees Margaret and Ben kissing, and is that the weeping moment? Because she has a little cry. A little cry in the taxi, and then Ben jumps off a cliff. Sorry, but yeah.
That didn't make me cry either. Oh my god, see, again, the dad. Do you remember when the dad was also then suggesting he jump as well? And everyone was like, no.
Nose to toes. Oh, you crazy?
See, again, that was so much funnier. That was so much funnier. Yeah. And again, the reason I think this movie doesn't work is because what do we know about Benedict? Or Ben? He works in finance.
We know he takes cocaine occasionally because he works in finance.
Yeah. How does his work impact the story other than the fact that he can afford really expensive plane tickets? Where does he work in terms of finance? He has a computer with graphs in his apartment. I don't know what that means. He has an ATM in his apartment, which felt like an attempt at screwball quirky, but it's just weird.
Yeah.
Like, why?
And I can remember them pointing it out, but I can't remember seeing it. It just felt like a really nothing... I'm just like, I know that happened. I've seen this film twice now. I know that happened, but like, what does it look like? And then he has I still don't understand why his mum gave him a spanner. Like, what?
Because everything's fixable, Lily.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah. And she was like, I'm going to give you this, like, enormous symbolic object. But why a spanner? Because we don't know anything. Did his mum, like, work in mechanics? Or did she just have this wrench spanner lying around? It just feels unbelievable because it's given absolutely no context.
Again, it feels like they took aspects of what a rom-com is and what the backstory is, but then they didn't load it up with anything like his mom dreamed of a son who would work in finance. Yeah, and you pointed this out, that the helicopter at the end, it doesn't feel like a rom-com thing.
No, it feels like an action movie thing. It just irritates me because it just feels really improbable. First of all, he just jumps. He's just like, okay, I'm just going to run and jump off a cliff, and this is my plan. And it's like, okay, did you check for rocks before you jumped off that cliff? Did you do that in advance? Did you do like some like recce in advance? That's the most ridiculous. Sorry, just in terms of water safety, I just remember being told like a load of times, don't jump off cliffs into water because you don't know if there's rocks beneath that. But yeah, and then the fact that the rescue crew agreed to drop him off at Sydney Opera House. Why didn't they give him a fine? It just doesn't, like, I'm just like, that just feels really improbable. I know this is a grand gesture moment, and maybe you can suspend your disbelief a little bit. And it's about him, you know, it makes sense thematically. It's about, like, the dad that jumped off the moving train, and it's also him, like, overcoming his fear or whatever. But practically speaking, like, the emergency service is, like, going to have better things to do than drop you off at the Opera House. You're going to get fined for that.
The thing about grand gestures is that they do feel over the top and unreasonable, but they need to be emotional enough for you to not care about that.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah.
That's the reason why this makes no sense. It's because it doesn't feel emotionally impactful enough for you to care about anything other than why that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Yeah, it's contrived. Because it's the grand gesture, like in Harry Met Sally, the grand gesture is that he runs to meet her at midnight. And, you know, there's some stakes attached to that because he needs to get there by midnight. That's the kind of time limit because it's New Year's Eve and he's having to run along a load of roads and get there in time. She may or may not accept him or whatever. But, like, it just feels contrived. Like, yeah, I don't know, it just irritates me. It doesn't need to be this big of a gesture.
It feels too big for the gesture that it is. In, Pretty Woman, he climbs stairs for her. What are they called?
The fire escape.
I think that the reason they did this is because the actor before was in Top Gun Maverick.
Yeah.
I wonder if this was meant for the boys or whatever, but I mean, I'm not a boy, so I don't know.
But why? Nobody cares if he's jumping out of a helicopter. Nobody finds this interesting.
I would even find this excusable if you were like, this is an action film star. Let's use the chops that he has.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Let's use the abilities that he has. But I thought when they fell into the harbor before, that actually was cute.
We're gonna die.
We're not gonna die.
We're gonna get hypothermia.
The water's 90 degrees.
We're gonna get eaten by sharks. Fuck, we're gonna get eaten by sharks.
We are gonna be fine.
Yeah.
But now it's ruined by this because it feels so bizarre. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Sydney Sweeney's character, she's dropping out of law school.
Mhm.
Why? I don't know. She just doesn't know that she wants to be a lawyer. Okay, but this doesn't set up anything. This sets up issues that are not really a problem at all.
Yeah.
At no point does she then talk about what this means other than she doesn't know what to do. And even that isn't really like explored in any way, shape, or form. And I've seen Sydney Sweeney now in so many different things, from beginning from like Handmaid's Tale. But she's such a featureless doll in this movie. And it's the thing you talked about with Australia. There's a lot of moments for her to be like in beautiful dresses and bikinis and stuff. But that character has no personality. She can't act. Why didn't you give her anything? And whatever version of the play you've seen, or even if you read it, Beatrice has loads of personality.
Yes.
And anyone but you constantly reminds us that this is based on Shakespeare. I don't know that anyone knows her as anything, but she isn't anything in this movie.
Yeah, no, it's really, really disappointing. And also with the whole law school thing being her problem, that's internal conflict for her, it feels like similar with Australia. It's just like random prompt generator, like this rom-com is going to be set in Australia. The protagonist is going to have dropped out of law school. And it's just that flat, and there's no reasons behind it, and there's no actual exploration of any consequences. It's boring writing, and it makes a boring movie.
The director who also co-wrote this, he made Easy A. I know he can make good comedy movies that say something different about our understanding of romance and sex, for example. Like, he can do that. I just don't understand. If you wanted to put more slapstick in this when they spend the night together, why not make her not being sure as to whether she should leave in the morning because she woke up first? Slapstick. Her getting up and like, should I get dressed? Should I not?
Yeah.
This whole setup is that he made her grilled cheese the night before. Why is she in the movie walking outside on the phone and going like, I don't know why I left?
Yeah.
Why don't they put it in the script that she was getting breakfast because he made her dinner?
Yeah.
Like, that makes more sense than her being on the phone going like,
yeah,
I don't know why I left. And I'm like, I don't know
No.
either. But like,
and then later she's like, oh, it's because I was really scared because I hadn't emotionally connected with someone in that way before. But you don't really get that from the way that she's acting. It would have been nice if she'd maybe dropped some hints that that's how she was, that's why she responded that way. Because it just comes across as, oh, whoops, quirky, ha, lol, and for no reason.
Even if you didn't want to add slapstick to her leaving, even if you showed her waking up, getting dressed, and showing her face that she's not certain about what to do here, that would have then made sense with the phone call going, I don't know why I left. And that would have set up that she doesn't know how to react in that moment because she hasn't been with someone in a while and she just broke off an engagement. That is a big thing. Again, something that I keep forgetting because it's nothing to do with this movie, really. And even if you watch movies like Bridget Jones, which despite the fat phobia in that movie, that's a person who feels like a real person who exists. Bridget Jones is chaotic, but also really fun when she's with her friends. And again, you don't get that from that character, from Bee's character at all.
Yeah, no, it's like, I mean, Ben calls her a disaster, and then she's like, haha, I'm a disaster, haha. And it's like, it just doesn't feel true. I think that's how she's supposed to be set up. But it's like, it just doesn't feel true because this is Sydney Sweeney. She is very conventionally attractive and doesn't seem to do that much wrong, but some things seem to be going wrong. It's just like the film doesn't try hard enough to make her a mess. She should be more of a hot mess for this character to work, and it just doesn't go into that enough. It doesn't give her enough moments of being messy and a bit chaotic, if that's what they wanted to do, which seems like they're paying lip service to without actually showing us anything.
And now I'm gonna be kind. I think it starts off really strong. Yeah. Also, I saw that you watched this and you said something on Letterboxd about this, that you were like changing your tune a little bit about this movie.
I know, yeah. I think I said, because I really didn't like it the first time I watched it, and we're still ripping it apart right now, and I think it's deserved. But actually, watching it for the second time, I was like, oh, I think it was just that the familiarity made me care more about the characters. It also says something about watching it for the first time, I didn't care about the characters. But because I've been thinking about it and then rewatching it, I kind of now feel like I know you slightly better. Literally just because of that familiarity. I don't know, I did find it charming. By the end of it, I was like, oh, nice, they're together. Even though I've just been saying that it's rubbish and, yeah, I don't think they're great, I still don't think it's a very good movie. It's an okay movie, it's fine. And I enjoyed rewatching it.
But I feel like that was most of the reviews. They were like, I mean, it's not offensively bad, but if this is meant to be like our comeback for rom-coms, are you kidding?
Yeah, and I think my main issue with it is that it's not a very good Much Ado About Nothing adaptation, and it's pretending to be, well, it's saying that it is, but it's like, actually, just say that you're not. There's no, apart from the fact that, like, having, like, Shakespeare back you up you have this sort of validating effect, like we talked about, of Shakespeare, which means that you have this IP that you don't have to spend any money on, but it automatically gives you a cultural boost. And so that's, I guess, why they've done that and decided to make it a Much Ado About Nothing, in scare quotes, adaptation. But it's just not, though. And embrace that. You know, you're telling a different story. You've literally just kicked out the whole plot. You're telling a different story, and that's fine. Stop saying that you're something that you're not. It's fine.
And we both said this when we watched this, when we were looking at what's the most modern adaptation of Much Ado About Nothing. When we watched this movie, we both said that it's so bizarre because if you hadn't told us, we wouldn't have accused you of plagiarism.
No. Yeah, not in the slightest. I mean, yeah, the one thing I think they got right in this movie, my favourite part of this as an adaptation was that they adapted the character Dogberry into a cake box. So, like, because that character could be so annoying. That was my least favourite character when I studied it, and I was like, it felt, I was like...
they got rid of the cop.
Yeah, they got rid of the cop, the annoying, irritating cop, and they turned him into a cake box, and I was like, that feels like... I can't think of the right word, but, like, I was like, I feel like... It's not vengeance, but it's something like that. I feel vindicated. So, yeah, thank you, Gluck, for doing that. But...
They called the characters B and Ben, but even then I wouldn't have been like... Is this Much Ado About Nothing?
Yeah.
But,
No.
Okay, again, what I liked, their meet cute to me was really, really adorable.
Mm-hmm.
She goes into a shop and she cannot access the restroom. She picks up a loaf of bread and that's then the grilled cheese that he later makes her. I thought that that's adorable. Yeah. The fact that he's being courteous and kind by pretending to be her husband without being creepy. I thought, this is adorable. I don't know that the shenanigans in the bathroom were that funny, but like...
Yeah, no, I wasn't... Like, I didn't find that funny. But like, yeah, the meet cute is cute.
It's so adorable. And you're saying that you find this kind of good enough in terms of a rom-com and not good in terms of a Much Ado About Nothing. I think it's fine. But I feel like I take offense with both these things. You take offense with one of them. In the 90s and the 2000s rom-coms, there was so much... I mean, everything's still racist and sexist and all that, but there was so much negging in terms of getting a woman to go out with you. And I love the meet cute because they are going out because he's stepping towards her to step on the toilet paper that she has stuck to her shoe. Is so sweet.
Yeah.
And then she turns around and she's like, oh, he's stepping towards me. And then she goes like, what did she say? Like, were you going to ask me out or something like that?
Yeah. Or are you going to ask me out now?
Yeah. That's so
and then
sweet.
that's called back at the end. And it's called back at the end when they're at the Sydney Opera House. She's like, are you going to kiss me now? She says like, are you going to kiss me now?
Oh.
Which is actually, it's just quite cute.
Okay, that is
like,
adorable.
Nice. That's a nice bit of symmetry.
I didn't pick up on that. But that is cute. Okay. 3 times. I've seen this 3 times. Anyway, yeah. But I feel like this movie is... Okay, I think I would argue that this movie thinks that 2 conventionally attractive white skinny people, like cishet people, are enough to carry a film. We talked about what do movies say about the time that they're adapted. And this movie to me screams desirability politics. It's about the jock and the cheerleader. The 2 hot people are fucking, can you please clap?
Yeah.
Deschanel says something interesting that wasn't in the McDonald's text so far that I've seen. But Nancy Meyers and Nora Ephron had the desire to not just tell stories about pursuing love, but also giving the audience, specifically women, a chance to laugh at themselves in stories about falling in love and wanting to find somebody. And as Olivia Rodrigo tells us, love is embarrassing. If they wanted to make a rom-com for the 2020s, why not make it for this time? Saying something about love and subterfuge and tricking people into dating. And what does that mean? In the 2020s, if you have queer characters or characters that aren't white, why are they the background characters and why are they bland as shit? What are people struggling with in the last 10 years? A lot of people are struggling to pay their bills. That already adds tension and stakes to things. But B dropping out of law school means she's not going to be a lawyer, right?
Yeah.
At no point does anyone mention rent or money in any way, shape, or form, or what consequences this has. She was going to get married.
Yeah.
What, did they live together? Does she have a problem finding housing? That's quite a current issue. So if you wanted to make a movie that was about us in the 2020s, I don't understand why this movie didn't even attempt to do any of that.
It just has no stakes. There's no emotional stakes to it because it doesn't have any sort of form of actual, like, there's no consequences really. Everything's cushioned. And even if this is supposed to be about escapism, like you said before, the crying needs to mean something. For this to be a story that people care about, there needs to be some more conflict. that actually means something, and yet nothing about Bea dropping out of law school or her leaving her fiance means anything. Like, there's no real consequences to that we see.
And something that people have been very critical of, for good reason, of rom-coms is the heteronormativity. Everyone isn't necessarily interested in falling in love. And in these movies, one of the staples is the best friend character who pushes you into dating and pushes you into having sex and just constantly mentions, hey, you need to get laid or you need to find a girlfriend. But even that isn't picked up in the 2020s rom-com in this for some reason. I don't understand that.
I think it's also, it's funny as well, because again, it's one of those things that kind of goes back to Much Ado About Nothing. That's a trope or whatever within a feature of Much Ado About Nothing, is that the characters are trying to make these two characters date because they're like, actually, these two people should be together. And that's like even something from 400 years ago that's going on.
Yeah.
If that's happened 400 years ago, what does that's the context of then. What's the context of now? Can we do something interesting with that?
But being pushed together again means nothing because, oh, she's actually into you. Oh, he's actually into you. And then they immediately drop it being like, oh, we were tricked. Like, you didn't believe this, did you? And I'm like, why drop the tension? They drop it immediately.
Yeah.
It doesn't add to anything. I just don't understand it. And the tension in this is meant to be that they're distracting everybody by fighting all the time. But even that isn't true, really.
Yeah.
They're just being annoying. That's another thing. These people are so fucking old. Sorry, I need to stop cursing so much. But these people are so old to be acting this way. That's the thing that I don't get. This man is meant to be in his 30s. That makes no sense.
Yeah. And sorry, just to jump back to the heteronormativity and the best friend or family pushing the leads together. They keep that aspect of it, which, to be fair, is true to the original, but then we've kind of talked about a bit already, they kind of get rid of this criticism of heterosexuality or heteronormativity that's in the original version, because they get rid of the hero and Claudio plotline.
Yeah.
So then there's maybe in some ways like that balances it a little bit, because okay, here are these characters being pushed together, but here's the consequences of heteronormativity going too far, and actually these two people now need to meet each other in this particular way where it is a marriage of true minds, to quote, I'm skipping to 2005 version.
No, but I do think that's true. The mom character who invites the fiance, that doesn't add anything to this. That could be the moment where they could have been more critical of the heteronormativity in that moment. Like, why does the mom need her to bury this man? Like, when that clearly just didn't work out for some reason. But he just feels tagged on, and he doesn't seem to add anything necessarily. Yeah. And Much Ado works because it's very funny. Enemies to lovers works. As a plot, it just does. You don't need to reinvent the wheel here. But they then immediately jump into fake dating, and then they add in another love interest. Even Shakespeare drops Don Pedro as Beatrice's love interest very quickly, because at the masquerade ball, when Don Pedro proposes to Beatrice, Jesus. Like, even Shakespeare knew to drop that. We don't need another love interest. I don't understand why they didn't just make this two queer couples who are very different from each other. And I feel like if you add any stakes to this, if you had the fat character in this, I think it would make so much more sense. It could have been about Ben making a comment about her body, and she misunderstands it to be fat phobic. And then at the end, him also having to learn that being in a fat body means something very different. They don't have enough disabled characters in storylines like this, but that would have been so much more interesting. It would have added stakes to this, and it would have made me more interested in watching it.
Yes, agree.
And we started this segment talking about how in 1993, making 50 million was a big deal on a budget of 5.8 million pounds. But now the industry demands that movies like this that get a budget of 20 million make this much money, make hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah. Very financially successful, but in my eyes, not very. I don't think I will ever watch this movie again.
Fair enough. So yes, that was one of the less successful adaptations of Much Ado About Nothing. And next episode, we'll be focusing more on what other versions have gotten right in how they've adapted the play. So yeah,
we'll see you then.
See you very soon. But for now, a quick halfway point joke to round out the episode. What did Shakespeare call his shower?
I don't know, Lily. What did Shakespeare call his shower?
Look bar. Wah wah.
See you in part 2.